Hello everyone. I'm a new creator, Glasses.in. This episode, we talk about how the memory industry exploded in the AI era. What's driving memory manufacturers crazy with profits isn't the GPU itself, but a high bandwidth memory placed right beside it, HBM. Meanwhile, on the other side, China's CXMT earned a net profit of 33 billion renminbi in just one quarter. After 10 years of grinding, China's memory industry has finally elbowed its way onto the card table in this wave of AI.3 companies. JHICC, CXMT, and YMTC have walked three completely different paths and met three completely different fates. This is the second half of the memory melee. It doesn't matter if you missed the last episode. This story stands on its own. For the past 50 years, memory has been the cruelest and least sexy business in the chip industry. Unlike other chips, memory is standardized like steel or oil. Customers don't care who you are. They only care about the price per gigabyte. When the market was good, everyone expanded like crazy. When it turned, prices collapsed, and every wafer sold at a loss. But after the AI explosion, the rules suddenly changed. The larger the AI model and the more powerful the GPU, the more it needs a special kind of memory. Its defining feature is high bandwidth and speed, but it's incredibly expensive and extremely difficult to scale production. Thus, a technology that sat on the bench for 16 years suddenly became the scarcest strategic resource of the AI age, that it's called HBM. And this whole story starts with a league of losers. Rewind to 2008. In AMD's lab in Austin, Texas at AMD, NVIDIA's old rival making graphics cards, was not doing well. A researcher named Brian Black was staring at a set of data, worried. Over 20 years, graphics computing power had increased by tens of thousands of times, but the memory bandwidth feeding it data had only grown about 100 times. What does that mean? Think of it this way. The processor was built into a 16-lane superhighway, but the road leading to it was still a country path. Everyone was jammed at the on-ramp. Black coined a term for this, the memory wall. Later, people calculated that a top-tier GPU spent over 90% of its time just waiting for data to crawl over from the memory. Black came up with a counterintuitive solution. While everyone else was trying to make memory faster, he said, "Don't make it faster, make it wider. Stack memory chips layer by layer like a building right next to the processor, connecting data through thousands of microscopic vias. The volume of data passing through at once would leap from a few hundred bits to thousands, then tens of thousands." This was the earliest vision of HBM, swapping that country path for dozens of parallel bullet trains. But the vision was one thing. Finding someone to bet on a market-less idea with a down-on-its-luck AMD was another. AMD went to Samsung first, the world #1 at the time. Samsung refused, betting on another technology path. AMD went to Micron. Micron also refused, following Samsung's lead. In the end, only one company took on the job. The one we talked about in our last episode, SK Hynix, a firm that had twice been on the brink of bankruptcy. Why did they take it? A later Hynix executive put it bluntly, "We were backed into a corner by bankruptcy. This was the only thing we could do." The two richest companies missed an opportunity that would later be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The poorest one picked it up because it had no other choice. The fate of the entire second half was sealed in that single choice. What followed was Hynix's 16-year stint on the bench. In 2006, it began secretly researching that core stacking technology. In 2013, It produced the world's first HBM in Incheon, South Korea. That same year, the technology was set as an industry standard. In 2015, AMD released the first graphics card using HBM. What happened next? The market was utterly cold. There was no AI boom back then. No one needed that kind of memory bandwidth. This chip, built with Herculean effort, was critically acclaimed but commercially a flop. From 2006 to 2022, a full 16 years, Hynix had almost no viable market for it. R&D alone burned 86 billion won, and with equipment and facilities, over 1.5 trillion won. A company that almost went bankrupt twice poured its meager fortune into a direction with no return in sight for 16 years. If the story ended there, Hynix would be a classic cautionary tale. A poor company wasting money on unwanted tech. But in late 2022, something burst onto the scene and changed everything. The AI wave triggered by ChatGPT swept the globe overnight. Every tech giant frantically snatched up NVIDIA GPUs to train large models. And every top-tier NVIDIA GPU needed that wide and fast memory. HBM. The memory wall Black saw in 2008 became the industry's most critical bottleneck in the AI age. And only one company in the world had been quietly walking this path for 16 years, holding mature products and the deepest know-how in its hands. That Hynix's bench-warming days were over. In June 2022, it started supplying NVIDIA with HBM3. From that moment, the words spoken by Che Tae-won on Valentine's Day 2012, laughed at by everyone, began to come true. Data will be the next oil. And the former hegemon, Samsung, went in the exact opposite direction. IT had refused AMD and bet on another path. That path later became a dead end. By the time it realized it needed to chase HBM, it was already too slow. But the truly fatal blow was a choice on a technical detail. When stacking memory chips, how do you bond them and dissipate heat? There are different processes. That Hynix's method had better heat dissipation, while Samsung's was about 10% worse. But don't underestimate that 10% in an AI server with tens of thousands of chips packed together. The temperature is already high. A chip's lifespan halves with every 10 degrees Celsius increase, and it throttles itself beyond 85 degrees due to overheating and power consumption issues. Samsung's HBM repeatedly failed NVIDIA's validation. In 2024, Reuters broke the news that Samsung's HBM3 had not passed NVIDIA's tests. Months later, Samsung admitted it in the traditional drum era. If Samsung's product was a bit slower or yield was worse, it could just slash the price and the market would absorb it. But in the HBM era, the rules changed. What decides your selling eligibility now is a certification list from major clients like NVIDIA and AMD. If you're not on the list, a low price is useless. You simply aren't qualified to sell. This led to an unprecedented scene in memory history, in the crucial HBM supply chain for AI chips. The once dominant Samsung was left behind by SK Hynix, and even briefly overtaken by Micron. By the second quarter of 2025, Samsung's share of global HBM shipments had plummeted from 41% a year earlier to 17%, but on the same table, SK Hynix took 62% and Micron took 21%. By Q2 2025, measured in Korean won, Hynix's revenue surpassed Samsung's for the first time by a margin of roughly 600 billion won. Since surpassing Japan in 1992, Samsung had reigned for 33 years, over 10,000 days. the memory throne had a new occupant for the first time. That little brother, twice facing bankruptcy, stepped over the former king to sit on the throne. Even more staggering is the profit that in Q1 2026, Hynix, a memory seller, hit an operating profit margin of 72%, surpassing even NVIDIA. How can a memory factory suddenly earn this much? Take apart a top-tier NVIDIA AI chip and you'll understand. The most expensive component is actually that ring of HBM around it. Pricier than the logic chip at the center doing the calculations out of the hardware cost for each such chip NVIDIA makes. Nearly half goes to Hynix and Micron for the HBM, the rest goes to TSMC for foundry and packaging. In other words, in the hardware bill for this AI feast, the memory factory is the first to pocket the cash. The logic is simple. In a value chain, money always flows to the most scarce and hardest to scale link. In 2026. That link happens to be HBM. An industry despised for 50 years as a seller of raw materials suddenly stood at the very front of the profit-sharing line. But interestingly, the capital market still hasn't fully woken up. Even with such earnings, Hynix's P/E ratio hovers around 5 or 6 times long-term, priced like a cyclical stock ready to crash at any moment. In many investors' minds, memory is that boom and bust trade at the mercy of the market, undeserving of AI's high valuation. Is this bias correct? Is this memory cycle just another cycle? Or has it become a structural growth story? That is the biggest suspense of this feast. There's also a chain reaction here. Producing HBM consumes massive capacity. Processing the same wafer into HBM takes about 3 times the capacity of making standard memory, but yields only 1/3 of the effective storage capacity. In other words, for every additional gigabyte of HBM a factory produces, it has to cut 3 to 4 gigabytes of standard memory. So the three giants frantically shifted their most advanced capacity to the most profitable HBM, severely squeezing the capacity left for standard memory in phones and PCs. That is why, in 2026, even obsolete production lines, fully depreciated and meant for retirement, were fired up again to reap windfall profits, and the price of a single memory stick multiplied. This AI-fueled memory feast sent all three companies into the stratosphere. Within just a few weeks in May 2026, Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron saw their market caps successively break the $1 trillion mark. In the 50-year history of the memory industry, there had never been a moment when three companies stood atop the trillion-dollar valuation simultaneously. The most surreal is Micron, the poorest little company that started in a dental clinic basement, where the CFO used a hairdryer to dry chips one by one. On May 26, 2026, its stock price skyrocketed 19% in a single day, officially pushing its market cap past $1 trillion. Just a year earlier, it was barely over $100 billion, a tenfold increase in 1 year. That error-prone, seemingly unkillable Micron proved one thing over half a century. On this company-devouring track, surviving long enough is the greatest victory itself. While the three were turning upside down internally, a fourth player officially took a seat at the table: China. China is the world's largest memory consumer, guzzling over 30% of global memory chips, but its own production capability was long less than 5%. Money flowed overwhelmingly to South Korea and the U.S. In 2014, the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, known as the Big Fund, was established, leveraging trillions of yuan into this industry. In 2016, three major projects launched simultaneously: Fujian's JHICC, Hefei's CXMT, and Wuhan's YMTC. These three walked three totally different paths, meeting three totally different fates. The first, JHICC, took the road of collaborative development with Taiwan's UMC and stepped right into a legal minefield. Micron sued it for technology theft in 2018. It became the first Chinese memory company on the entity list the day after the listing took effect. All the foreign equipment engineers in the factory left, a $6 billion facility, basically complete, came to an instant standstill, leaving behind piles of blueprints and uncalibrated parameters. But JHICC didn't die. Forced to start from scratch, years later it stubbornly produced chips. Ironically, in 2024, a U.S. court finally found it not guilty in an 8-year war that ended in winning the lawsuit, but with a bitter ending. The second, CXMT, took the path of acquiring a legacy. The CXMT's starting point is interesting that IT cast its eyes on a fallen European giant. Qimonda. Qimonda was once a DRAM company spun off from Germany's Infineon and the last representative of Europe's memory industry. In 2009, it went bankrupt in the last memory winter, leaving behind a wealth of patents, technical data, and engineering experience. For the big three, this stuff was no longer cutting-edge weaponry, but for a Chinese DRAM maker starting from zero, they were a map that could help navigate the first swamp. CXMT's approach was to use Qimonda's remaining tech legacy as a foundation. But a legacy is ultimately a legacy. To truly enter the race, it had to invest in its own R&D, chasing forward generation by generation. CXMT's early products were DDR4, slightly outdated, unable to immediately challenge Samsung and Hynix. By 2025, CXMT finally got its window. The demand for HBM from AI sucked away a massive amount of Samsung, Hynix, and Micron's advanced capacity. The supply of standard DRAM and mobile memory was squeezed, sending prices up. That CXMT was perfectly positioned. IT wasn't the top-tier HBM supplier, but it could provide a large volume of mainstream DRAM. IT wasn't a global giant, but it had a backstop from China's local phone, server, cloud, and consumer electronics clients. As a result, this company suddenly switched from chronic loss-making to high growth and profitability. In 2025, CXMT's revenues surged, achieving its first annual profit. In Q1 2026, its net profit reached 33 billion RMB. IT is about to IPO on the STAR market to fund further expansion and process upgrades. More importantly, by capacity, shipments, and revenue, CXMT has become the world's fourth largest DRAM player. But the real tough nut for CXMT to crack now is HBM. Catching up in standard DRAM shows you have basic memory manufacturing capability, but HBM is a different beast. It's not just making DRAM. It involves stacking multiple memory layers, bundling advanced packaging, heat dissipation, yields, and customer certification together. Any weak link here keeps you out of the top client's supply chain. There's already news in the industry that CXMT has delivered HBM3 samples based on a 16 nanometers process to Huawei and its partners. This move shows it's reaching a hand toward the highest battlefield of AI memory. Maybe there's still a gap to Hynix's most advanced HBM, but at least it has touched the door handle. As for the third, YMTC, it's actually not on the same track as the first two. IT focuses on flash memory, NAND, which is a different business from DRAM. The story of flash memory deserves its own episode, so I won't elaborate here, but I'll just mention that YMTC, using its proprietary stacking technology, has brought its flash memory to the global forefront, grabbing over 10% of global market share. In terms of stacking layers, it has essentially caught up with Samsung and Hynix.so. As you can see, whether it's DRAM or NAND, China has squeezed onto the card table. It's just still a stretch away from the very top. Of course, the gap with the cutting edge is still significant, especially in the most advanced HBM, separated by several generations that U.S. sanctions are also tightening round by round, restricting everything from equipment to the HBM chips themselves. But the sanction sword is double-edged. Does slow China down, but it also turns China into a guaranteed market that no one else can take. Sanctions block overseas giants from freely supplying companies like Huawei. On the other hand, domestic brands like Xiaomi, Oppo, and Vivo, to avoid being choked, proactively shifted 30% to 40% of their memory orders to domestic factories. This effectively built a flood levy inside the oligopoly's encirclement for Chinese fabs. With this drought or flood-proof local market, CXMT, and others finally got a stable cash flow to spin the flywheel of expansion and cost reduction. China's memory self-sufficiency rate has jumped from near zero a few years ago to over 10% in 2025. At this point, we must answer a question we haven't directly addressed. Why? Why? After 50 years of brutal warfare in this trillion-dollar industry, have only 3 players survived? There are 3 answers. First, it burns money to an insane degree that a state-of-the-art memory fab today costs over $20 billion. And 70% to 80% of that cost is equipment, which depreciates and becomes obsolete in 5 to 7 years. Once a fab is built, you can't get off the ride. A wafer fab can't be turned into a milk tea shop or an office building. You must keep production running, gritting your teeth. Second, its cycles are violently volatile. When times are good, gross margins can surge to 66%, 70%, like printing money with your eyes closed. When times are bad, you lose money on every wafer sold. But you can't stop production because stopping means a pure loss on the depreciation of that $20 billion equipment. Thus, everyone is trapped in a prisoner's dilemma, forced to keep producing even when bleeding, dragging the down cycle longer, and more painfully. 9 out of 10 memory price crashes aren't actually rooted in a lack of buyers. On the contrary, crashes often happen when end demand is still growing. What really pushes prices off a cliff is something called the bullwhip effect. Real end demand only fluctuates a little, but this tiny fluctuation, passed upstream from phone and PC makers to the memory factories, gets amplified into violent booms and busts. When prices rise, downstream players, fearing shortages, frantically overorder, making hoarding demand look insanely hot. Once they realize they've overstocked, orders collectively slam the brakes, and prices instantly crashed. The memory factories' busts often can't be blamed on the market. What repeatedly slaps them in the face is their own customers' panic. And because of this, the contrarian strategy of investing heavily in a downturn is fundamentally not about bottom fishing or gambling on luck. Every penny invested in the trough is buying a lower cost curve for the next cycle. When the market recovers, your cost is drastically lower than your rivals. That's pure profit. The ones who survive to see the recovery are always the ones with the thickest balance sheets, the ones who can most afford to burn cash. Conversely, Those companies that cut production to prop up prices when times are bad end up with even higher depreciation costs per chip on lower output, causing their costs to rise, not fall, and often dying faster. In this arena, contraction is sometimes the most dangerous choice. Third, its products are highly commoditized. Memory isn't like CPUs or GPUs. It has a unified standard. Everyone's is interchangeable. The customer only looks at one thing: the price per gigabyte. So, even though the big three control 95% of the market share, they have no real pricing power, only able to compete by slashing prices to death. This also explains a puzzle outsiders often find strange. In the chip industry, NVIDIA can just design and outsource production to TSMC, a fabless model, and still become a trillion-dollar giant. Yet, the memory sector has never produced a single successful fabless company. That there's no NVIDIA of memory. Why? Think of it this way. A logic chip is like building blocks. You draw the blueprint, and a construction crew like TSMC builds it accordingly. The blueprint designer doesn't worry about how each brick is fired. But a memory chip is more like building a pyramid. The blueprint designer and the stone hauler must be the same people. Its most valuable expertise lies precisely in the art of making the tiny capacitor that stores charge even smaller, without letting the charge silently leak away. This feel, which can't be written into a blueprint or outsourced, is where the magic is. That if there's the slightest disconnect between design and production line, the yield rate can instantly drop to zero. Historically, Taiwanese memory companies toyed with the idea of being asset-light, wanting to offload the heavy manufacturing. But when the market crashed in 2008, without their own fabs as a backstop, their market share tumbled, and they were quickly squeezed out of the cutting edge. So, for highly standardized commodities, the opposite is true. You are forced to hold design and fabrication in the same hand, getting into the trenches yourself to outlast your rivals. This is the fundamental reason why memory ultimately only leaves a handful of asset-heavy giants standing, stacked together. These three factors mean that roughly every 10 years, a major trough arrives, like a reshuffling that wipes out an entire nation's players. The 1985 cycle eliminated most U.S. companies. Later cycles eliminated Germany's sole Qimonda, the entirety of Japan's players, and Taiwan's memory fabs. Thus, these three oligopolies are the final product of a 50-year capital meat grinder, a result of natural selection. But this round of explosive growth in 2026 might be different from any in the past 50 years. Historically, memory price surges had a natural break. If they got too expensive, ordinary people would buy fewer PCs and delay phone upgrades. Demand would drop, and prices would correct themselves. But this time, that break has been stomped into pieces by the tycoons of the AI circle. In 2026, demand for phones and PCs is actually shrinking, with phone shipments down over 10%. And PCs similar. By the old rules, if demand falls, prices should drop. But not only are they not dropping, they are still surging, because the main buyers of memory have changed. They are no longer price-sensitive consumers, but cloud giants like Microsoft, Google, and Meta. To stay in the AI race, they will grab it no matter the cost, even signing multi-year long-term contracts in advance and borrowing money to hoard, locking up capacity completely. When buyers become a group of giants who don't care about the price, only about securing supply, the break that relied on ordinary people's thrift has utterly failed. That's why this price surge is more ferocious and unstoppable than any in history. The story told. We return to that chip more expensive than gold. This meat grinder has been running for 50 years. It has eliminated most of America's players, all of Japan's, and Germany's only one. Now, it faces just 3.5 opponents: Samsung, Hynix, Micron, plus a China that hasn't yet been fully allowed to play. And when the next downturn comes, will another one be eliminated? No one knows. But all three have their own vulnerabilities. Hynix relies too heavily on a single client, NVIDIA. Every time NVIDIA sneezes, Hynix catches a bad cold. Samsung is holding its breath, wanting to turn the tables. With its next-gen technology, betting on its technical confidence, Micron's biggest risk is geopolitics. Its share in China is already plummeting. But what might truly end this feast is perhaps the cloud giants themselves, the ones now frantically footing the bill. The logic is simple. The AI hasn't changed the deepest law of the memory industry, as long as prices are high enough. All manufacturers will expand. As long as expansion is enough, supply will eventually catch up. The real question is, in 2027 or 2028, when new capacity comes online, can AI revenues match this capacity? If Microsoft, Google, and Meta find that their purchased computing power isn't translating into enough cash flow, will they suddenly slow down procurement? If demand slams on the brakes just as supply gushes in, this meat grinder will start spinning once more. If you compress this 50-year memory war into one sentence, it's not really a story about genius, but rather a story about survival. The IT rewards those who had no choice but to keep walking forward after others gave up. Hynix bet on HBM all those years ago not because it foresaw the future better than Samsung. IT was just too weak, too poor, and had too few options. Samsung could choose. Micron could wait. Hynix couldn't. That it had to place its meager chips on a path with no market in sight, and then sit there for 16 years. So, this isn't a simple underdog comeback story. That it's more of a cruel joke played by the memory industry itself. For 50 years, this industry has continually dragged players into the trough, forcing them to burn cash, bleed losses, and keep investing when they saw no hope. But real opportunity often only goes to those who have already endured too long in the abyss. AI has made this machine spin faster, made HBM pricier, and turned Hynix from a failure into a king overnight. But the machine itself hasn't stopped. The next cycle will come. The next technology bet will come. The next batch of new fabs will open. And when that happens, today's winners will have to face judgment once more. The memory war truly has no final end. IT simply counts again after every trough. Who is still alive? That wraps up the story of memory. Thank you for your patience. I'll continue to share such business and tech stories. Making in-depth videos isn't easy. If this content inspired you, please like, coin, and subscribe. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep going. See you in the next story.